Got some great questions coming in. With about 10 minutes to go, let's go to one that is from Chris Sawyer at Automotive Design and Production in Michigan. Question is, you meet Tier 2 Bin 5 standards, the toughest standards in the world, but those standards will tighten in the future. Seeing how difficult and expensive it has been to meet the current standards, what problems do you anticipate in meeting the standards yet to come? Tom.
Well, that's a great question, Chris. We're not going to stop with the level we are today. As I mentioned in my presentation, we have an efficient dynamics strategy, and we have blue performance strategy for diesel engines, and we have a huge number of development engineers working as we speak on getting diesel engines down to super ultra low emission level and beyond. It is an enormous challenge. It's very, very difficult, but the great benefit that we have is, as I explained, with the piezoelectric injectors, we've got great suppliers, great partners in Steyr and Bosch, and with this electronic control and feedback, we can do tremendous things. So it's a huge challenge, but we're up to the challenge and we'll do it.
Point was raised earlier about which models we're bringing the advanced diesel in, but I don't know if we've addressed just yet a question had come in earlier about transmissions. Only automatic transmission, you mentioned, Joe, in 335D.
Correct.
Why is that?
Well, I think Tom can answer this more specifically, but in general, our diesels have so much torque, we haven't developed a manual transmission to accommodate that much torque, 425 pound-feet of torque. Tom, can you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, our diesel X5 and 3 series are using, as Joe mentioned, the V8 automatic transmission, and for us to develop a manual transmission that would be beefy enough, robust enough to take that kind of torque. Its torque, as Rich Breckus mentioned, it's almost as much torque as our V12 engine that is double the size, a 6-liter that puts out about 444 pound-feet of torque, and this diesel engine puts out 425 pound-feet of torque. So it's a lot of torque to get you launched. It's exhilarating when you drive the car, but a manual transmission just wouldn't be appropriate.
And we should also add that manual transmission is not available in any market on this car, so
Correct.
Or any market on this engine.
Yep. Okay, next question comes in from Tom Cannell at Cannell and Associates in Michigan. How will you cope with the wide variety in cetane ratings in ULSD fuels across the US, Canada, and Mexico?
Well, the cetane rating of diesel fuel is kind of like the octane rating for gasoline, and that gives you an indication of how volatile the fuel is, how readily it will ignite. And so the range of cetane ratings across the United States, Canada, and I wouldn't think that Canada would have a significant difference in cetane rating, but it might. But the engine has, among other things, a heated fuel filter, so that in the wintertime, it will prevent the formation of wax crystals forming in the fuel. The system is electronically controlled so that there's a feedback loop. As I mentioned, there's an algorithm or formula that evaluates all the inputs from the sensors, and the engine can actually adjust and accommodate all of these factors. When you're driving, the vehicle electronics are testing, evaluating, measuring. When you let off on the gas and you're in coast down mode, the engine is actually testing the engine every time you go into coast down mode. It's testing to see if the engine injection rates are proper and if the balance of the engine is correct for low emissions. So we think with the electronics, we should be able to accommodate that very well. Good question.
Yeah, and it's noteworthy to point out that diesels have been in Europe for so long. I mean, this question is nothing new for our engineers in Europe. As we mentioned, we sell so many diesels in Europe. This issue with cetane is obviously apparent over there, and they've already conquered that. I think we're okay with the conditions of the fuel in the US now that we've brought in the ultra-low sulfur diesel.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes to go. We have more than a half a dozen questions still in the queue, so let's keep going through a few more. This comes from Don Warner in Washington. Average miles from 1 gallon of AdBlue. It might be important to note, is there any differentiations with AdBlue relative to our advanced diesel in the introduction?
Well, AdBlue is a trade name in Europe. We call it diesel exhaust fluid. The generic chemical name for this reactant is AUS32, which means it's 32.5% urea, the active ingredient, and then 67.5% water. And to answer your question, how much you use per mile or how many miles per gallon, it probably is better to give you the scenario of someone who is about to run out of this diesel exhaust fluid. And the scenario would be that when you get down to about 2.5 quarts of this diesel exhaust fluid in your active tank, which is the tank feeding the engine, when you get down to about 2.5 quarts, you will get a yellow indicator in the instrument cluster that tells you you have about 1,000 miles left of this diesel exhaust fluid before you need to refill it, before you'll be empty. And so this 1,000 miles of 2.5 quarts or liters indicates that you need to start looking for replenishment, or you're probably more than likely approaching when you have to have the engine serviced anyway. So that countdown continues until you reach about 200 miles, and then you will get a red indicator telling you that the engine will not start if you reach 0 miles. And this is really required by the EPA. They've interpreted the Clean Air Act to say that when an engine runs out of this reactant, the engine is not allowed to run. So the 200 miles counts down, and then when you might reach the unlikely event of 0 miles, if the engine is shut off for more than 3 minutes, it won't restart. And that's really a critical time, and we don't expect anyone to reach that because they will certainly have sufficient warning. So if that helps you calculate backwards about 1,000 miles for 2.5 liters, perhaps that's a useful number.
Okay.
So it's just like a gas. If you run out of gas, your engine's not going to start. If you run out of diesel exhaust fluid, you're not going to start as well.
Right.
Makes sense.
Okay, we have just a few moments left. We'll take one more question and then we'll begin to wrap up. This one is from Sunil Tehran in x5world.com in Illinois. Do the unique engine features for the U.S. compromise anything?
That's a good question. I think in general, we do always tune our engines for the U.S. We have different driving conditions, so there might be some minute differences between the tuning of a U.S. diesel and a European diesel. But in general, the experience, the torque, and the performance of our diesels in the U.S. are very similar to what we have in Europe.
Still the ultimate driving machine.
Yeah, of course.